Welcome to the Determinetruth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We're continuing to go through our study in the book of Revelation, and it's another scholar week where we got to bring in a voice. And this is exciting when I remember reading his book, Seminary, and that was eye-opening for me. So Rob, who do we have today?
Yeah, we are so excited to have a good friend of ours, Professor Michael J. Gorman. Michael holds the Raymond E. Brown Chair in Biblical Studies and Theology at St. Mary's Seminary and University since 2012. He's taught at St. Mary's since 1991. Not that he's that old. He was just a child prodigy. So Dr. Gorman earned his MDiv and PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's a New Testament scholar who specializes in theology and spirituality of the Apostle Paul, the Gospel of John, the book of Revelation, and the theological and missional interpretation of Scripture. He's the author of nearly 20 books and numerous articles, including several volumes on Paul, as well as his works on Revelation, John, the Atonement, Christian ethics, and biblical interpretation more generally. His writings include Cruciformity, which we had him on to discuss that book in an earlier podcast. There, we'll put the link maybe for that in the show notes. But Cruciformity, he's also written Paul, the Apostle of the Crucified Lord. He's written a commentary on the book of Romans. We did a podcast with him on that in August of 2022. And of course, the book we're here to talk about today, Reading Revelation Responsibly, which I think is one of the really good, insightful looks at the book of Revelation. And we'll put the link for that in the show notes as well. Michael is an avid traveler, led numerous trips to Turkey, Greece, Italy, and France. I know he just finished a sabbatical, or he's finishing a sabbatical, where I think, Michael, you got to go to those places again. He's an active United Methodist layperson, married to his wife, Nancy, for more than 3 decades. They've been holding a Bible study in their home, a prayer group in their home. They have 3 children and 8 grandchildren. Michael, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks, Rob and Vinnie. It's great to be back.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
Hey, Michael, as we have these interviews with scholars, one of the questions we always like to ask is, what do you think the big picture of the book of Revelation is? How do you generally go about introducing this when you talk about the subject?
What I like to do is start with a really big picture and say that it's obvious that Revelation is the last book of the Bible. And so it ends with Genesis, from creation to new creation. And that's the movement of God in salvation and in history. So I like to start there. But then to get more specific about the book itself is to say, this is really a book about all of the New Testament. It's about 2 things primarily. It's about Christ and following him. Who is Jesus Christ and what does it mean to follow him? And specifically in the book of Revelation, that means Jesus is the crucified Lamb, the Lamb of God.
Yeah.
And we are called as his disciples to follow him and not the culture around us into this new creation that God's about to unfold. So that, in a short way, that's to me a summary of this book. Yeah.
Excellent. And again, we're not going to look at all of your book here, and we want to encourage our listeners to get your book, Reading Revelation Responsibly. But we're going to want to narrow in this conversation with you, Michael, a little bit more specifically, and a couple things that you really point out in that book that I don't think a lot of Revelation scholars and New Testament scholars go down that path a little bit. Your book lays a foundation in the early chapters, and then you start talking about genre. And then in chapter 3, you lay out what you call the substance of Revelation. And you say Revelation is responding to civil and imperial religion, worship, and narrative. Can you explain what you mean by that and how that fits both in the context of the book of Revelation and maybe how it applies to us today in the 21st century?
And how many hours will we be here?
This is part 1 of 24.
I think the long title of my book, title and subtitle, is important. And maybe
that's true. Yeah, good point.
That's a place to start. The book is called Reading Revelation Responsibly. Then the long subtitle, Uncivil Worship and Witness, Following the Lamb into the New Creation. So many people are fascinated by chapter 13, the Antichrist passage. And I think what many people miss is that what's significant about chapter 13 and the Antichrist, even though that word's not there, that kind of image, is a figure who is ultimately inspired by Satan, chapter 12, and promoted and supported by some, what we might call acolytes, some supporters who are symbolized by the second beast, the beast from the land. So that is ultimately, especially in conjunction with chapters 17 and 18, pretty clearly symbolic of the evil dimension of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
And the desire for this state, the Roman Empire, we'll call it a state, this entity, the political entity, to be the all-consuming and center of people's existence. It dictates who they are, what they're going to do, what they can and can't do, and what devotion to that empire and the emperor entails. And it entails this religious political mixture. So what the book of Revelation is trying to do is to define what that looks like and to say following Christ is the opposite of devotion to that reality. The only thing it's worth being devoted to is the Lamb who was slain. So at the very start, then, Revelation is a very political document. It is calling people to reject one form of politics, one form of public life, one form of religious and political devotion, and replace that with another form of devotion to someone who was not representing Rome, but who was crucified by Rome. As soon as you start talking about the mixture of religion and politics, you have quickly moved from interesting things about the first century to conversations about the 21st century.
Okay. Explain that. What do you mean by that, and how?
If we simply think of the book of Revelation as predicting some future evil body,
right,
namely some combination, as many people think, unfortunately, some combination of the United Nations and the Roman Catholic Church, or some other political future reality and person embodied in this Antichrist figure. If we simply think of the book of Revelation as predicting this future, very specific entity and personages, we miss, first of all, the fact that for the book of Revelation and its audience, its writer and its audience, these were all living realities. The Antichrist wasn't some future figure. It was the present reality.
Excellent point. Yeah.
But then, more importantly, for our purposes at least, if we think of this book of Revelation as only about the first century or only about some unknown future reality and personages, we miss the fact that for all intents and purposes, the book of Revelation is trying to say Babylon can be and is everywhere at any time, or can be anywhere at any time. Let me put it that way. Even using the word Babylon, I mean, Babylon was an ancient dead empire. It's symbolic of Rome, but as many scholars have said, it's symbolic of Rome, but also much more than Rome. And rather than trying to pinpoint some future Antichrist figure and Antichrist empire, it's much more significant to understand the kind of aspects or the character of Revelation's Babylon / Antichrist / unholy Trinity. I can come back to that in a minute.
Sure. Okay.
I already mentioned it, right? You have Satan, the beast from the sea, and the beast from the land,
right,
which are undoubtedly meant to say the opposite of God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So anyhow, unholy Trinity. Where does that exist in the current world, in the modern world, the postmodern world, whatever, the contemporary place? And rather than trying to pinpoint some evil person like, let's say, Putin or some other figure from the 20th century, as was done in the 20th century, let's look at what it is, in essence, that Babylon / Rome / the unholy Trinity is trying to do, is to elicit people's devotion to a religious and political reality that basically takes hold of them and becomes the center of their existence, the focus of their existence. So I don't know, maybe that's enough generality.
Excellent.
Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob does on a weekly basis to pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters that get special behind the scenes access. But we can only do this with the generous support that comes from those of you who can afford to give. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting us with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to work hard to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinetruth.com and click on the Give tab, or follow the link in the show notes.
Would you say that John was obviously the book of Revelation, and Apocalypse is an unveiling, a revealing of the way things really are, not what the way things appear to be? And that John's saying, hey guys, you don't see this.
Yeah.
It looks to you like this is okay, but I'm telling you what the way it really is. And so John's trying to unveil something for his readers that they're like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And that we can then take that to the 21st century and go, hey, maybe we too have been deceived by the beast, the prostitute, or the dragon. And so that we think, oh, it's this way. And John's like, no, actually, it's this way over here. And I think that was a really good point of saying he's talking about Babylon, which doesn't actually exist today, to say that the Rome is the incarnation of Babylon, and therefore we can say that modern empire. And I like the way that you use the word state, because we use empire, we think, okay, the United States is not an empire, or Russia is no longer an empire. But if we use state, it actually becomes a more relevant term. Am I getting onto something there that you would agree with?
Yeah, I like everything you've said. I guess I would nuance the state part, especially not because I didn't say it and you picked up on my language, but the more I've thought about it, especially when I think today about Christian nationalism, it's hard to know. People who have in a violent kind of way mixed some perversion of Christianity with a super nationalistic agenda. I'm not so sure they're committed to a state as they are to some imagined reality that isn't really. Give me an example. Christian nationalists, by definition, want the United States to return to its Christian roots and become a Christian nation again. No founding document is the United States described as a Christian nation.
Right, fair enough. Yeah.
Doesn't even. To me, the ultimate sign of anything being Christian, at least on the surface, doesn't mean it will be, but the first thing it has to do is mention Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mention Jesus Christ, you can't have Christianity. You can't have Christianity. Now, that doesn't mean if you mention Jesus Christ, what you're talking about is necessarily Christian.
Okay.
It could be the perversion of Christianity. But anyhow, I digress a little bit.
That's fair. Yeah.
Go back to your main point, Rob. It's clear to me, and I think it hopefully would be clear to our audience, that Revelation tells us something that we need to know.
Yeah.
It's not about some future individuals. It's about the way the world works, but it's not the way the world should work.
Yes. Yes.
It's not God's way of the way the world was intended to work. This is a world about power. The world perceived by and revealed by the book of Revelation is a world bent on power, violent power. Really interesting line when Babylon is described in terms of its merchandise, luxurious merchandise. And then the very last line, human souls, human lives. That part of this, to use some language from the 90s, part of this culture of death that is revealed by the book of Revelation is the ancient slave trade.
Yeah.
And that's three little words or so that can just be skipped over, but it's such a powerful indictment of the dehumanization of people that occurs in Babylon. I'll put that in quotes. So, anyhow.
Yeah. And Vinnie, feel free to jump in here if you want as well. One of the things I see, Michael, that Western, modern, contemporary Christians have trouble understanding is the fact that there's two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of the world. I like to refer to it maybe as lamb power and lion power. I'm not sure if you said that in your text or where it came from. Jesus is called the lamb 27 times in the book of Revelation, but he's only called the lion once. And the difference between the kingdoms becomes, as you said, that Rome puts people on crosses to maintain their power through violent means, whereas Jesus goes to the cross and suffers violence as the means of demonstrating his power. So laying that out there, we have that distinction between the kingdoms. And then we see that the empires of the world, whatever we want to call them, because I think it does transcend empires as well when you look at national corporations and global corporations that have as much influence on nation states as the states themselves do, that they often come at the expense of people, at the expense of the poor, at the expense of the marginalized, that they maintain their power for the sake of their own well-being, and almost always at the expense of those who are marginalized and the poor. And I think we have trouble seeing that in the Western church, because we tend to be the ones who are actually benefiting from the power and not the ones who are actually experiencing the suffering and oppression from those in power. Am I making sense to you there? And what do you think of that?
Total sense. And
okay,
what is sad about many, unfortunately, sad about many Western Christians, but not just 21st or 20th century Christians, but this has been unfortunately true throughout church history, is the notion that if we as Christians can just exert enough influence and power, whether it's at the local level or the national level or the international level, if we can just exercise enough political power or benefit from that political power, one or the other, or preferably both, then the world will be a better place, our country will be a better place, the church will be a better place. And the word of the gospel, the message of the gospel, is just the opposite.
Yeah.
It's
tragically,
not. This is where some people wonder why you, who is primarily a scholar of Paul, why do you even care about the book of Revelation? I think this is where Paul and Revelation go hand in hand. I mean, I just finished, you mentioned a sabbatical. I just finished writing, and I'm proofreading at the moment, a commentary on 1 Corinthians.
Yeah.
The first few chapters of 1 Corinthians are all about the wisdom and power of Christ crucified, wisdom and power of the cross. That's the opposite of this sort of sacralization or sanctification of the power and military and economic might of any reality, Roman, American, whatever, because according to Roman or American standards, this is the opposite of power. It is powerlessness. And that's the foolishness of the cross. That's the foolishness of the gospel. What's amazing to me is how Revelation and, say, 1 Corinthians do go so hand in terms of exposing the unreality of typical understandings of power. And I keep mentioning this word power because I don't want this to be simply an anti-Donald Trump statement, but I'm going to quote Donald Trump and then say some of the same things could equally apply to any other president, including the current president, Joseph Biden. That is to say, Trump at one point said, when I'm in power, you evangelicals or you Christians will have power once again. You'll be back to where you used to be. And that's the language of Revelation 13.
Yeah, the beast.
That's the language of the beast. Yeah. What we need to be hearing from within the church, and we should expect this from political figures. And Joseph Biden can say the same thing. We're going to make sure we keep X policy in place because then you have power, you have rights, you have what you deserve. Okay. There's certainly a legitimate place for rights in the political sphere, but there's also a critique of that the book of Revelation would make. But anyhow, my point is the church has been sucked into this mindset. Yeah,
exactly.
It would be great. Exactly. It'd be great if we could be back in power. And to go back to your comment, what we really are talking about is two kingdoms in conflict.
Yes.
And what too many Christians want to do is merge those two kingdoms. And that's like oil and water. That does not work. And when it does work, it spells disaster.
But it's enticing, and that's where deception comes in, because it is so enticing.
Yeah, I have this passage. My favorite passage in the book, and I don't have it handy, goes something like, sounds silly to talk about the favorite passage in your own book, but
but I was so brilliant when I wrote this. I almost think it should be inspired with the scriptures too, but I'm not going that far. Yeah.
I want to engage in a little self-deprecation. No, okay. The rest of the book's horrible, but this one passage
there you go. That takes care of it.
Talks about propaganda, and basically what propaganda does is over time it makes the abnormal seem normal. It makes evil seem good.
Yeah.
It makes everything look just the opposite of what it really is. And that's why we need the book of Revelation, to go back to your language, to unveil the reality of what this civil religion is. And why I talk about uncivil worship is because I don't mean to be uncivil in the sense of mean-spirited, but we need to be engaged as a church in worship that does not buy into the civil religion or the Christian nationalism or whatever happens to be the mixture of politics and religion of the day. That's what we need to avoid.
Yeah, I'm just curious, Michael. You wrote the book initially in 2011. It would be really interesting to see if an update could come out. And I know that you weren't necessarily trying to address current events then, but I'm curious. Around page 48, and for a section, you talked about American civil religion. And so I'm wondering, in light of the rise of Christian nationalism, which you address in the book a little bit there, especially as we approach the 2024 elections, how might you present this information differently, or maybe even more emphatically now than you did 13 years ago? What are some critical points that you'd want to emphasize?
Yeah. To go back to a point I made earlier, when you use the name or the image of Jesus, that doesn't necessarily mean, and often doesn't mean, that what you're talking about has any connection to the real Jesus or has any connection to legitimate Christianity. And so I think the thing I would emphasize even more, and I'm not sure quite how I would do it, but what I would emphasize even more is that Christian nationalism is fundamentally unchristian. It's not just marginally Christian. It is, in fact, anti-Christian. And
can you explain why you say that and what you mean by that?
It's on this sort of theological level.
Sure.
Yeah. And I've already alluded to this with the discussion of 1 Corinthians 1-4. Right. In theological terms, what Christian nationalism does is it maximizes, it's a perverted maximalization. It maximizes a resurrected, powerful Jesus and completely avoids, denigrates, suppresses Christ crucified. Right. And any theology that does that is perverse, because the message of the New Testament is Christ crucified and the resurrected Christ are one and the same. You can't have one without the other. The resurrected Christ remains the crucified one. Ernst Käsemann, after the Nazi era, said it, a New Testament scholar and theologian, said it beautifully. I've quoted this hundreds of times. The cross is the signature of the risen one. The cross is the signature of the risen one. To me, that encapsulates so much of what my book is trying to do, Vinnie, and what I would want to emphasize. Even in some of the Christian nationalist events, whether we go back to January 6th or other events, pictures of Jesus, and sometimes crosses. But this is smoke and mirrors. There's no cross there. There's no crucified Christ there. There's no absorbing violence. There's no love of enemy. There's no love of no love of neighbor. Instead, there's love of power.
Exactly.
And love of influence, love
of self.
Yeah, it's ultimately love of self.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It is love of country.
Yeah.
But it's love of a particular version of the country. And
exactly.
It goes back to your two kingdom thing there, Rob. You've got love of country. The thing about Christian nationalism, not only is it not Christian, it's not even very religious.
Yes.
It's primarily I mean, it is religious in the sense of using religious language and hoping for some kind of religious power. But as polls have shown, many of the people involved in Christian nationalism don't even go to church,
Right.
don't practice normal Christian practices, and their primary interest is in the United States, not in the kingdom of God or not in the church. Back to your question, Vinnie, I think somewhere in the book, when I list out these characteristics of Christian nationalism, one of them I mentioned is syncretism, where you've blended some version of the dominant culture. And this is why nationalism can take place in a so-called Christian context or a Muslim context or a Jewish context. When you blend a kind of Christianity light or Islam light or Judaism light with the dominant political systems or values to get power, that's a form of syncretism, which is ultimately and fundamentally unchristian.
We hope you're enjoying the podcast, and we want to remind you that everything we do at Determined Truth, the podcast, Rob's blog, and our YouTube channel, is available on the Determined Truth app. Directions on how to download the app is available in the show notes and on the determinedtruth.com website. Just click on the app tab.
One of the things that you pointed out was, and you made the comment about love of neighbor, the idea of Christian nationalism. We think, oh, this is a good thing because Christianity is a good thing and it'll make the world a better place and make the United States a better place. But ultimately it's exclusivist. So it says it's for us and it's not for you. And there's actually no love or respect for the neighbor, even though it's shrouded under this. It's actually in the best interest of everybody, but it comes at the expense of everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to speak about all Christian nationalists, but certainly most of the movement, it's fundamentally not only against blacks, but against people of other ethnic origin, people who are not white. And you can deny that all you want,
right? But
when it comes to the policies that are vaguely veiled about what this direction is, it's anti-immigrant, it's anti-black. We want to go, this is what I was talking about earlier about this, not exactly a state, but some kind of imagined reality. We want to go back, they want to go back to this time where everybody was Protestant, Christian, white, and
male, to be honest too, right?
Male dominate, yeah.
And Revelation's exposing this to say, this is the way the beast works. This is the way empire works and not the way the kingdom of God works. Therefore, John says, Revelation 18:4, come out of her, my people. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. You've had Warren Carter, and he uses the language of the empire of God, and others have too. I have myself. Empire of God versus the empire of Rome or the empire of whatever. Yeah, I think the critical question is, to put it in the language of Matthew Bates and other, to what are we pledging our allegiance? And pretty clear, unfortunately, that some of the people that we're talking about, and again, I want to respect them as human beings. I want to respect them as people who, from my point of view, are misled. And ultimately, I may sound a little crazy here, but I really do believe that the beast and its acolytes are inspired demonically or satanically. Yeah. In that sense, I believe in the unholy Trinity. I believe in its existence. And that there are demonic powers at work, and people are, again, to go back to a term you've used, and I certainly agree with, deceived. Yeah. It's such a deceptive, and what is Satan called in Scripture, among other things, the father of lies.
Yeah, the deceiver. And this is what is troubling me so much, Michael, and the things that I'm speaking up on, whether it comes to Israel, Gaza, or Ukraine, whether it's my blog or the live streams that we've been doing, is that the church is, first off, we're not acting like the church or advocating church-like things, Christ-like things of cruciformity, to use your language there, to say we are to be sacrificing ourselves for the sake of the neighbor and for the sake of others, and loving our neighbors. But then we're buying the propaganda that's being given to us to say, oh, look at how evil Hamas is. We have no other option except to eliminate them. What you mean by that is, at this point in time, 37,000 people in Gaza that are dead, 75,000 or more people that are injured, 11,000 or more that are missing under the rubble. But that becomes justified because I had a live stream last week, Michael, where I had two voices on this said, what else is Israel to do? And it's okay, not kill 37,000 people is what there has to be a way that the church should be advocating for. And again, if you don't agree with this, that's fine. We can delete it from the episode. But there has to be a way for the church to say, we need to be the ones advocating for peace and justice for the sake of everybody. This cannot be good for Israel. This cannot be good for Israelis. It cannot be good for Jews in America. And this is certainly not good for Palestinians and the people in Gaza.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think there's a couple of things you raised in that question, in that comment, with which I'm in substantial agreement. First of all, Stanley Hauerwas used to love to ask this question. When you use the word or the pronoun we, who are you talking about? And I think that's part of the problem. We need to do this. We who say that are usually Christian Americans who don't know how to separate themselves from the we of the United States or we of
good point.
So what does it mean for us as Christians to say and to do what Christ would call us to say and to do? And to go back to Hauerwas again, he would say our first job is to be the church. It's not to fix the world. However, I would nuance that a bit and to say, when we are the church,
exactly,
we will, not we, but God can, through Christian activity, do good for the world. And what's extremely problematic in the current situation, from my point of view, in Israel and Gaza, is first of all, that the United States is uncritically giving just as a citizen, I'll speak for a minute, then I'll come back as a Christian. If I were just simply saying as a citizen of the United States, so uncritically giving aid to Israel in the way of huge amount of weaponry, while the rest of the world, almost the entire rest of the world, is saying this is crimes against humanity, and we're just ignoring. The United States is just ignoring. So that's my first we statement. Then for us as the church, and these two are related, the church, so much of the church is so pro-Israel, uncritically pro-Israel, as if that were the be-all and the end-all of Christian ethics related to the Middle East. So pro-Israel that Christians can't step back and say Israel is doing something horrible to the people of Gaza. Because Israel, by definition, and then you can start quoting Old Testament or whatever, they're supposed to take out their enemy. That's the way of God for the people of Israel. There's no simple solution. I don't think any Christian wants to countenance what Hamas did.
Sure, exactly, right.
No one is saying that, but the retaliation that has occurred with uncritical acceptance by so many people in the Christian community, and especially by so many American Christians, is, to me, very hard to understand.
Yeah. Let me take it another direction as well now, just in the contemporary conversation here. And again, Vinnie, sorry if you want to jump in.
No, I'm enjoying it.
Okay, great. Do you also see the beast and beastly activity or the harlot activity in the sense that people are profiteering from war? And so here we go to, let's say, Russia and Ukraine and say 500,000 Ukrainians have died. And we have had and I'll say we again, the United States and its people has had the opportunity to help advocate for diplomacy, but they haven't taken that diplomacy, maybe perhaps because there's too much pressure on the politicians to continue a war because people are benefiting from it. I might be overstating the case a little bit there, but the arms manufacturers and those who profit from this, and by the way, it's not just the United States, because the European Union gave $1 billion in weapons to Ukraine as well. So we're continuing a war that's really not in the best interest of the people on the ground who are dying from this war. Instead, we should be brokering a diplomatic solution to this that brings peace for everybody.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on international relations.
Neither am I. Yeah.
I'll say two things. One is there's absolutely no doubt that empire, theologically speaking, that empire benefits from war. It benefits from, and it's sacral. It has to make it appealing, especially for people who call themselves religious or Christian or whatever. You have to turn that any kind of violence, including war, into a sacred reality, a sacred practice. This goes back to Vinnie's question. In the book, I talk about how you have to, in the American context, you have to talk about any larger context as well, a kind of redemptive understanding of violence. You have to make it holy.
Yeah.
And then, so that takes place, and you make it holy, so then it's wholly acceptable, HOLY, WHOLY, acceptable for empire's firms to benefit from all the sales of manufacture and sales of weapons. But to go back to a point that I really emphasized, and to be fair, when I emphasized in the United States mixture of religion and politics, at the beginning of the war, you had this in the war on Ukraine. You had the same thing going on in Russia, where many of the higher ups in the Orthodox Church were vocally supporting Putin's invasion, and out of fear for their own safety and so forth, refusing to criticize. And some priests who did criticize got in trouble, either with their Episcopal authorities or with the government. And I haven't followed that probably in the last year or so very carefully.
Yeah, I haven't either.
But that's just another example of it. And the church for the most part, the church in Russia failed. The church in Russia failed.
Yeah.
To be critical. It was in bed with them. It was Revelation 13 all over again. It was the beast of Putin and the Russian army and politicians, and the acolytes, the supporters, in the form of the so-called prophets, the beast from the land, supporting the beast from the sea. So,
yeah, I think it's so helpful too that we bring in the Russian example, because oftentimes around this topic, it will seem just like an anti-American issue that we're presenting from within. And this is just another great example to say, no, Christian nationalism is not specific to America. This is something that you could see in any sort of nation state that might have some sort of connection in name to Jesus.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons I brought it in, but I'm glad you put it that way. Because
it reminds us too that because the just war theory has been thrown out so much, and I think the Southern Baptist Convention just made some decisions recently about just war theory. Okay, but if we say just war, then what do we do in the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church went to Vladimir Putin and said, this is a just war, you're justified in invading Ukraine? We've got just war theory on both sides of the war. Somebody can't be right. They both can't be correct.
I don't know exactly what the Russian Orthodox argument was. If it was a theological argument, it was pretty lightweight, and I think caused by fear, legitimate fear. I'm not
sure.
In the United States, now talk about anybody in the United States, we are used to being able to largely state our opinion without fear of political or other kinds of recrimination.
Hey, Michael, as we start landing the plane, and we obviously always want to look at application for the listener, because folks, the people who are going to be listening to this podcast, they're not in a position to, they're not making national decisions or anything like that.
Sure.
In your book, you continue on your theme of cruciformity, which is just fantastic. I know we plugged the book last time. If you haven't picked up Michael's book on cruciformity, that's just a gold mine. But you present your cruciform interpretive strategy, in which you just employ the reader of Revelation to live with that sort of ethic. What are some ways that you would encourage us in light of that as we study Revelation as just the layperson?
Yeah, just to rehearse for a moment, the word cruciform is an architectural term that means cross-shaped. So you have churches that were built in the shape of a cross. Anybody who's gone to a cathedral has probably experienced that. But for the last 100 years or so, it's been used as an adjective to describe a cross-shaped way of living, cross-shaped spirituality, cross-shaped Christian life. And as a noun, cruciformity is simply my way of turning that adjective into a noun. But with respect to Revelation in our own daily lives, I think we need to recognize the problem. And the problem is, to go back to something I said earlier, the powerful resurrected Christ has essentially, in American Christianity, and not just in Christian nationalism, has been decoupled or unhooked from the crucified Messiah. And to me, this is the fundamental problem of American Christianity. And it can be liberal, conservative, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox. It can be Baptist, Methodist, whatever. And as soon as you decouple Christ crucified from Christ resurrected, you're gonna have a misinterpretation of Christian life, Christian power. So the first thing we need to do is just return to an ethic and a spirituality of following Jesus and understanding his way, which is a way of self-giving love for neighbor, no matter who that neighbor is, no matter where they come from, whether they're black, white, brown, whether they come from Guatemala, Mexico, Kenya, wherever they come from. That our calling is to be engaged in as both individually and corporately in self-giving love for those people, to look out for them. I have some relatives who are deeply devout Southern Baptists, and they're beautiful people. They have spent the last 20 years working to resettle asylum seekers and other immigrants in one of the southern states here in the United States. They're absolutely committed to their Southern Baptist roots, faith, some of the decisions that are made perhaps even, but they're living out their faith in completely cruciform ways, taking on part-time jobs because they don't have enough financial support to do this, but they do it day in and day out, finding apartments, finding furniture, teaching the people, helping them to learn how to negotiate the streets and the buses and wherever. It's a beautiful ministry. So that's the kind of, not that we're all called to that specific thing, but that ought to characterize the Christian church and Christian individuals at this time, rather than going to political meetings, whether national or local or whatever, and trying to regain so-called Christian power. We need to exert a different kind of Christian power, as you talked about and I talked about in the book, to specifically say, I'm not going to support a church or a Christian organization that is supporting or engaging in unchristlike activities, whether that's promoting the war on the people of Gaza, whether it's trying to overthrow the government or the elected officials or elections. Forget about political power. Go for land power. And figure out what that means in your own context.
Can I ask you a question here off script a little bit? Because I think what you're getting at a lot of is we need to go back to Jesus. And I just think of the gospel stories and what Jesus was modeling in the gospels. And so much of the modern church, the contemporary Western church, in my experience at least, is we focus so much on Paul. So many sermons are Paul. Here you are, a Pauline expert, so I don't want to be offensive to you. But what we've done with Paul is we've taken the Western individualism and said, okay, what does Paul say to me? What does that mean to me? How do I live this out? What does that look like for me? And I think we lost sight of the Jesus communal, sacrificial sense of saying, my kingdom is about making a world where there are no more poor, making a world where not only do we care for the poor, but we care for the poor so much that we made it so that there's no more poor. Not that we're ever going to achieve that, but that's the goal and the aims. Am I making sense there?
Yeah, but the only thing I would question is whether that's really a difference between Jesus and Paul. I think Paul did all those same things.
Yeah, fair enough.
Paul has been misread.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, and I see great continuity between Jesus and Paul in many ways, including everything you just mentioned. But the mantra that I use with students is, and when I preach often, to go back to the question that Vinnie raised about cruciformity, in the New Testament, the cross is not only the source of our salvation, it's the shape of our salvation.
Amen. Amen.
Until that happens, so evangelicals in particular, and I'll count myself as one for the moment, as much as that has been abused in this country, evangelicals are so crucicentric, so centered on the cross. Okay, that's great. But not only on the cross as Jesus died for our sins, Jesus' death on the cross is the paradigm of how we're to live. That's the kind of power we're supposed to practice.
Amen. Thank you so much, Michael. This has been great.
Thanks for being so generous.
Appreciate your work so much.
And thank you. Very kind.
Yeah. And your friendship and coming on and joining us as well.
It's always great to be with you and to support also your own work, Rob, as you've got a new fine book out. I was happy to endorse.
Yeah, thank you so much for endorsing the commentary. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Great.
Thank you both.
Yeah, so we
But-
definitely encourage everyone, put these on these need to be on your bookshelf. The Cruciformity book, which we'll link to. Rob, you had mentioned Michael's book on the crucified apostle. Is that the name of it?
Apostle, what is it?
Also the crucified
The
Lord.
Crucified Lord.
Yeah.
Yes. And there's 2 editions. I just picked up the second edition, and it really is. There's so much more new information in there too. It's not just a reworking of the cover or something. So that's a great resource. And then of course, Reading Revelation Responsibly. Those are 3 great works amongst the many that Michael has done over the years that will just really, I think, bless your study. So pick those up. We'll link to them in the show notes. Michael, thank you so much for being generous with your time again.
Thank you, Vinnie, and thank you, Rob. I've always enjoyed being here, and all the best to your podcast and your audience.
Thanks again, Michael, so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate
I really appreciate it. Okay.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day. All right, man. So we just had Michael on, always a delightful person. And I'll even say this. I remember first hearing about Michael Gorman in seminary when we were recommended this book and his Pauline book in a New Testament class. And I remember the comment made by the instructor, which he said, the thing with Michael Gorman is he's a great scholar, but he's even a better man.
Yeah.
And he was just described as a kind man. And seriously, that he's one of the sweetest people I've ever met in my life.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was going to say. We've talked about this before, that when you listen to somebody and you don't agree with what they have to say, but they have character and intentionality and integrity. Okay, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen carefully. We should listen to everyone carefully. But just because they say something you don't agree with, don't dismiss them, especially when their character is so, it's like, what would drive a person of that kind of character to say or believe that? Yeah. Okay, let me examine and evaluate that. I won't give you the stories, but Michael is one of those genuine scholars, and we've talked about this before, that he's one of those genuine scholars that is just a super nice human being, a godly man. He lives this out. He's humble, and yet he's one of the elite scholars in the New Testament world, and yet he comes on our podcast. So what does that say for us?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I am going to delete out the references to the Baptists there. That was he went way overboard with that. I'm going to allow that to make the final cut.
Yeah. So what are some of your things that you took away? I know that I was just sitting back enjoying the back and forth between you two guys as you discussed applications and identifications in the modern world. Is that where you expected the discussion to go?
A little bit, because his book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, takes us there a little bit more than most others do. And I knew that when we had some of these interviews going on, that some scholars would be more reticent because they just haven't thought or processed, what does this mean for the 21st century? And what does this mean for us today? And I knew Michael had done so, and I thought that would be interesting to have that conversation with him. And he just takes it, he always takes it back to that. Okay, let's be practical in terms of what this means for us in terms of living it out as well. Not necessarily being overtly political about something, but he put that political conversation, even when he brought it in the context of godly living. What does this look like? So I thought it was excellent.
Yeah, it was interesting in reviewing the book, and I don't think I've read it since it came out in 2011, and I think I read it in 2011 or 2012. I read it early on. I know it was 2011. And so in the last 5 years, especially, the major push and emphasis on Christian nationalism that has just come across our American paradigm and how much has been written on it in that period of time. I look back on a book that was written 14 years ago, and it's, wow, he was really ahead of the curve to address those things then. And then also what a risk it was, because it wasn't popular to say those things back then. And so good for him for having the foresight to say them and the boldness to say them. Good for the publisher to actually publish that. Yeah. Because that's now it's almost like an in vogue, sexy thing to address. Like you have to have that topic. And he was willing to do that when that wasn't the thing.
And I don't think this was on Michael's agenda at all, because I think his character is so incredibly great. It's one of those, you wonder, okay, he was pretty stable in his posts, because Scott McKnight said this. He said, I can say these things, but it's because I got a good job and I'm not worried about it.
Exactly.
You and I speak up, and guess what happens? We don't get good jobs any longer. We're not hireable. Yeah. Michael is so well respected, and he's so entrenched in his position that's good. But we need people like him to speak up, because it helps people like ourselves who are trying to speak up and feeling the effects of that, because whether it's people not giving to our ministry, or people not publishing our books, or people not giving us jobs, or whatever. Not to say this is what's happening to me, but it just adds credibility to what we're saying.
Absolutely. Where should folks go from here? Obviously, Reading Revelation Responsibly. It's a book on how to read Revelation, but I'm glad that he actually mentioned the subtitle. That's something that I haven't said for years. Uncivil worship and witness, following the Lamb into new creation. How does his book complement your book? If someone was going to continue studying Revelation and maybe they've already gone through Fall of the Lamb, your book, why would they pick this book up, or why would they pick up Scott McKnight's book and Cody Matchett's book? Are these just the same thing that's being communicated?
Great question. I think, and at the back of my commentary, I put some recommended readings, and his book was at the top of the list. What his book does then is it says, okay, let's look at what this means in the 21st century. So Fall of the Lamb is simply dealing with how do we understand the book of Revelation and what does it mean for us as Christians today? I really kept it in that first century context. I didn't provide any, okay, therefore we need to watch out for the beast here or the beast there. And even in my commentary, one of the questions that was asked by one of the reviewers of it to me privately was, okay, great, but what's the beast look like today? And I said, what I wrote was a commentary dealing with what it meant then. I didn't deal with what it meant today. And that's what we're doing in the podcast and some of the blogs and things like that. So Michael's does a great job of bridging that gap of this is what the book meant then, and this is what the book looks like in the modern world in light of Christian nationalism, in light of American exceptionalism, in light of American civil religion. He even goes into American civil religion, which we didn't get a time to discuss with him on that as well. And by the way, for the listeners, the book is only 150 pages. It's not that long of a book either. It's very manageable. Very, very good read.
Actually, it's about 185, but same thing. This is not this huge tome that you're going to have to schlep through. I would also say it's interesting, especially if I'm just thinking about this now. If you're a millennial, it's going to be relevant because Christian nationalism is the thing that is in your ethos right now. But if you're a Gen Xer, if you're a boomer, it's super relevant because not only does he engage with Christian nationalism a bit, but he spends a lot of time critiquing left behind theology.
Yeah, he did.
Which if you're a Gen Z or if you're a millennial, that's just probably not going to be something that heavily influenced you. But if you were a product of the late 70s and then obviously the 80s and 90s with the left behind, he's just going to spend a lot of time there. So it's so applicational. It's so relevant, really spanning our cultural moment and the things that have impacted us.
Yeah. Hey, really quickly, do a quick commercial. So you and I made some videos about a year ago. They're going to start coming out live. As this podcast goes live, the videos should start going live on the YouTube channel. And they're going to be 2 to 3 minutes long discussing end time stuff. So if you're interested in those or that piquing your curiosity, what do we think about the rapture or the tribulation? We made a bunch of videos that will be released on the YouTube channel. Make sure you like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That'd be great. And the next podcast we have coming up after this, next couple podcasts we have coming up after this, we're going to go much farther because I think Wes Howard Brooke has written in his book. Wes Howard Brooke is going to be our next guest. His book I first learned about by looking at a footnote in Reading Revelation Responsibly. So Michael Gorman footnoted Wes Howard Brooke's book. And I think Wes Howard Brooke takes this conversation a lot farther, talking about global capitalism and multinational corporations and what that looks like and the impact of that. And I think I think he's right on. I'm not sure where you're at. I know you haven't read the book yet, Vinnie, or if you even have time to read it before then. So I want to encourage you to listen to that very critically and go, what's going to happen here? And then we're going to have a guest on to talk about the trauma that he experienced growing up as one of those left behind generational type of individuals. So we'll discuss that topic a bit more in depth on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The YouTube channel that the videos are going to be posted on, which channel is that?
The Determined Truth YouTube page. And the link for that is on at determinetruth.com. There's a tab at the top of determinetruth.com for the YouTube. Click on that link. It takes you to the Determined Truth YouTube page, not the Rob Dalrymple YouTube page. Yep.
Okay. And we'll have some of those live by the time this episode airs.
Yes. A couple of them will be live. By
okay. And more of those going to pop up. And we please, this is something seriously, if you're still hanging out with us by now, please do this because these are new videos. They're not going to be circulating much in the algorithms. Please do us our favor. Watch the videos. Hit the like button on the videos because likes are going to help get them in the algorithm. And then if you can leave a comment, seriously, you guys are our base. The people who are listening to this podcast, you are our base supporters, whether some of you give financially, some of you don't, but you are our base because you're with us. Do this, and this will help get those out there so more people will be experiencing this information, and it will pop up on their feeds, even though they didn't necessarily go looking for it. Please do that for us. That's one of the greatest ways you could support us. Leave comments in the app on the Determined Truth podcast app in Apple. Give it a 5-star review if you feel it's 5-star worthy. But if you could do those things, especially if you're not someone who's financially supporting us right now, not everyone can, do that kind of support. And that really helps us out. And you might be thinking, okay, someone else is going to do it. No, I'm talking to you right now. Please do this. And that's very helpful for us. We would very much appreciate that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. And subscribe to the YouTube channel. Once we get to 1,000 subscribers, it changes the algorithm as well. So we're just about approaching 400. Let's get that to 1,000 soon. Thank you.
And maybe we'll give away a free car when that happens. Maybe not, but maybe we will.
A prayer hanky.
Or a prayer hanky, or just a prayer. Yeah. We'll pray for you. But maybe a car. it could happen. So.
With a hanky inside.
Oh, man. Or maybe it's a prayer hanky with a car embroidered on there.
Oh, there you go. That takes care of both at the same time. We'll do that.
Exactly. So next week, another guest. And until then, thanks for listening, everyone. We'll catch you guys next time.
At least you didn't say we'll see you next time.
I'll see them. I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.